Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This will be a rather short video, as it is a correction of some of my earlier work. In the past, I released a video titled Were the Nazis on the Left or Right? An attempt to rigorously define the political spectrum, in which I describe how the left-right political spectrum is actually 9 different but closely associated spectrums. While I still stand by the general idea, I have since developed this thesis considerably. And while I will eventually release a full overhaul, there is one point on which I was particularly off the mark and that I will be addressing with this video. In that original video, I described one of the spectrums as collectivism versus individualism. That conceptualization is hardly original, and has served as one of the cornerstone differentiations between the free Western world and the communist countries throughout the Cold War. I specifically describe how the central concern is the distribution of rights. Collectivist cultures view rights as held at the societal or communal level, whereas individualistic cultures view rights as intrinsic to the individual. There has been plenty of research and elaboration on this idea elsewhere, so I will leave the description at that. But I now believe the whole construction to be misguided, and I have identified where the mistake originates from, both generally and in my own video. The problem is the frame of reference that I and most other people I interact with are operating from, which is Western post-Enlightenment liberalism. To begin with, individualism as a concept is suspiciously absent from most of world history. This is odd for what is supposedly a conservative value. Almost all human peoples, both ancient and modern, fall under collectivism as defined both colloquially and by my own earlier definition. The very conception of rights as being objective, abstract things that can belong to individuals is definitely capital L liberal. No one thought this way until the Enlightenment. Everything was viewed in terms of subjective relationships between people, groups, and things, and the proper adherence thereof. Which is why it just so happens that the only cultures ever described as individualistic are those that have a heritage that connects them to the Enlightenment and liberal traditions in particular, which is Western Europe and the Anglosphere. So it seems a major cultural bias to describe the modern West as individualistic and everyone else as collectivist. Individualism is really just another way of saying liberal. And while I will certainly concede that liberalism is a unique ideology in the grand scheme of things, it turns the individualism versus collectivism spectrum into liberalism versus everything else, which is just silly. There are many cultures and ideologies that are not liberal, but are also completely dissimilar to one another, and collapsing them all down to not liberal destroys all nuance. As an example, let's look at 2 civilizations that are commonly described as collectivist, which are actually quite dissimilar: Japan and China. Japan is a highly modern, nominally liberal country, well within the Western sphere of influence. By contrast, China is a developing, communist country that is a regional power attempting to set itself up as a rival to global American hegemony. Neither are at all individualist, yet the nature of the so-called collectivism is completely different in both countries. In Japan, conformity is a bottom-up phenomenon born from a strong sense of national identity. They see themselves as part of a shared cultural heritage and members of a greater community, and the result is a demonstrably high-trust society. China is the complete opposite. Chinese conformity is a top-down imposition required by communist law and doctrine. Furthermore, China's cultural heritage and sense of community has been systematically ravaged by communist policy for nearly a century, and the state seeks to impose itself as an intermediary between its citizens and all aspects of their lives, which results in the breakdown of interpersonal relations. The result is a demonstrably low-trust society. This illustrates the problems with using collectivism as a category. It just does not describe anything useful. Something that makes this an even more interesting example is the fact that Japan and China would have started from rather similar positions a few centuries ago. China was always more metropolitan when compared to the notoriously insular Japanese, but the various regions of China would have been similarly communal and high trust before communist upheaval because they would have been bound by common traditions. Some of these traditions can even still be observed in spite of the best efforts of the Cultural Revolution. But the bigger question is, how does a collectivist society have a literal revolution and still wind up as a collectivist society? It only makes sense in comparison to the liberal West. So if the collectivism versus individualism spectrum is incorrect, and the very conception of viewing it as how rights are distributed is the wrong framing, what should replace it? In order to figure this out, I decided to revive an old thought experiment of the Enlightenment and evaluate it in light of modern knowledge. I am referring to the question of the state of nature. Many of the greatest thinkers of the Enlightenment, including Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, all attempted to answer this question, but they all more or less just used it to validate their own prejudices. But with modern anthropology, we can describe it more accurately. Now obviously this brief summarization I'm about to attempt is going to be highly reductionist, but hopefully it will capture the core of what I'm trying to get across. In brief, the state of nature for humans is tribalism, which is admittedly a term that gets bandied around a lot. I even have an earlier video discussing the concept. But here I'm using it in a very specific manner. The prehistoric tribal unit would have been roughly 150 interrelated people or less, and that is important for a number of social and logistical reasons. It is not an exact number. There are going to be examples of tribes that violate this 150 people limit. But as a result, they would have been inherently more unstable when compared to smaller tribes and prone to splitting apart. The reason for this is that psychological research has shown that the average human is capable of maintaining what can be roughly described as distinct and stable personal relationships with no more than about 150 people, a concept known as Dunbar's number. In other words, a person's network of friends and family is capped out at around 150. Anyone they know beyond this gets mentally categorized as a stranger, at best an acquaintance. The reason this is relevant is because interactions between people with close personal relationships do not need an external regulating force. Interactions between strangers, however, do need an external regulating force because they do not have pre-established expectations from prior interactions. This form of social organization has been readily employed by military organizations throughout history as the most basic command structure, from the Roman centuria to the modern rifle company, because it is the most natural way of organizing humans. The internal makeup of a military company is also insightful in this regard. A company is broken down into several platoons, and those platoons are further broken down into squads. For the prehistoric tribe, the platoon would be roughly analogous to a cluster of closely related families, and the squad with individual family units. Both of these conceptualizations, the ancient tribe and the modern company, will be useful in illustrating the nuances of this new spectrum. So for now, let's place tribalism as one half of the dichotomy and try to extrapolate out and determine what the other half should be. A good place to start is to imagine a hypothetical situation in prehistory where multiple tribes would have had to come together and live in close quarters for an extended period of time. There are quite a few reasons that such a scenario would have taken place, from winter camps to religious ceremonies. The first problem that must be resolved in such a situation is the outgroup problem. How do strangers from different tribes resolve the inevitable conflicts that emerge? The solution is some kind of overarching set of cultural norms that all of the tribes subscribe to. This would allow total strangers to interface with one another despite having never met, and allows the in-group to expand beyond familial kin relationships. Now there would be essentially two in-groups, the inner circle of individuals who belong to a specific tribe, and the outer circle of confederate tribes that share a culture. The outgroup would still consist of everyone else. Moving beyond hunter-gatherers, this process would become increasingly formalized after the agricultural revolution and the development of cities. For most of human history, there would probably never have been more than a few hundred people in any given place at a time, both because of low population density and restrictions on carrying capacity. But agriculturally supported cities could house thousands of inhabitants, and so the phenomenon of urban anonymization was born. It is thus no surprise that early antiquity saw the development of the first formalized religious doctrines and legal codes. These structures allowed everyone to understand expectations and proper behavior among strangers, a necessity if there was to be any kind of conflict resolution that did not immediately resort to violence. So what we've seen so far is that as population increases, Smaller tribal groups are able to mesh themselves together and form larger entities, creating local identities from tribal identities and national identities from local identities. So is that the other extreme to tribalism? Nationalism? Not quite, because while nationalism is on the opposite end of the spectrum to tribalism in terms of scale, true nationalism is still built from those smaller, more parochial identities. As has been shown countless times throughout history, people will typically fall back on the smaller scale but more strongly held identities when some large national project fails. But what happens when forces begin to undermine those most basic interpersonal relationships? This had never really happened in history on a large scale until the time of the European Enlightenment. Why that was the case requires understanding a multitude of cultural, technological, and political factors too complicated to go into in this video. But the result was the mass movement of people and general societal upheaval. The end result was atomization of the individual. Now this may at first sound like I've just arrived at another way of saying individualism, but there are some important differences between individualism and atomization. As I've already said, individualism might as well just be liberalism. But I would actually argue that all of the post-Enlightenment ideologies, so liberalism, socialism, fascism, and their various offshoots, are all examples of atomization. This may seem a strange position, since socialism and fascism are about as traditionally collectivist ideologies as you can find. So let me try to explain with a simple analogy. One of the most basic ideas in chemistry are the states of matter. For most materials, their natural state on Earth is as a solid. Solids are made up of molecules, which are closely bound together via molecular bonds, and thus more or less hold their shape under pressure. This represents humanity in their natural tribal state, a group of closely knit individuals bound by interpersonal relations. Now, if you provide enough heat to a solid, those chemical bonds will break down and the material will enter a liquid state. Similarly, if you break down the interpersonal relationships between people, they will become free-flowing and atomized. But a unique property that liquids have when compared to solids is that when poured into a container, the liquid conforms to the shape of said container. When applied to atomized individuals, the equivalent to a container would be ideologies. Socialism and fascism are merely different molds an atomized populace can be poured into, whereas liberalism is kind of the equivalent of just letting things puddle up where they will. This does mean the liquid will just conform to the shape of the floor via gravity, which does lead to some questions about whether liberalism is truly as freeing as it claims, but this video is not supposed to be a critique of liberalism, so I'll leave those questions unanswered for the time being. Instead, let us finally finish describing this new spectrum. On one end, we have tribalism, representing a societal order defined by interpersonal relationships. And on the other, we have atomization, representing a social order defined by ideological convictions. In regards to which belongs to the right wing of politics and which to the left, it is definitely tribalism which belongs on the right and atomization which belongs on the left. This may seem surprising at first, since it by definition places every ideology on the left wing of the political spectrum. Yes, that does not just include liberalism, socialism, and communism, but fascism, Nazism, and even libertarianism as well. I know there are many people who will be incredulous when they hear this, so I hope you will all stay tuned for future content because this is a topic I will definitely be coming back to in the future. So remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.